Have you ever wondered why some soldiers in the middle of war surrounded by bullets, mud, and death whispered prayers for boredom? Why did they long for the moments when absolutely nothing happened? When the air was thick with damp silence? When the only sound was the drip of water off sandbags and the slosh of wet boots against rotting wooden planks? Maybe you're listening to this late at night, with dim yellow light spilling onto your pillow or a ceiling fan humming gently. Above you, perhaps you're in Lahore, or London, or New York, or simply lying still in a quiet room with nothing but this voice for company. Wherever you are, this is a story designed to drift you into sleep, but not before it pulls you gently into one of the strangest truths of war. That in the trenches of World War II, silence was sacred and boredom was the most precious treasure. Tonight, we're going back to 1943, to a trench carved into the soft, wet earth of a European countryside. The kind of place where time didn't tick, it clung, where the mud smelled of mildew and iron, and every breath felt like sipping fog. In these trenches, young men wrapped themselves in wet blankets, not to keep warm, but to remember that they were still human. And one of them, his name was William, used to say, "I pray nothing happens today. Let us just sit here in this muck with wet socks and heavy coats and no bullets." That prayer, simple as it seems, was more common than gunfire. Soldiers didn't crave glory. They craved a day when the mud stayed quiet, when the sky didn't scream, when the enemy didn't come crawling over the wire. Boredom meant safety. It meant no one died that morning. The trenches were not always places of action. They were mostly places of waiting. Long, stretched-out hours where the only thing to do was scratch at your scalp or count the cracks in the wooden beams above you. Time stopped making sense. Days were no longer remembered as Tuesday or Friday. Instead, soldiers said things like, "The day we got the warm can of beans," or "the night the rat ran across my neck." The rats weren't visitors, they were residents. They chewed through letters from home, nibbled on hard biscuits, and sometimes slept on soldiers' shoulders like tiny furry comrades. One rat became so familiar that the men named him General Whiskers and saved him a crumb of bread each night. These weren't jokes, they were rituals, survival tools. Because in a place where fear lived in your bones, where a scream could burst from the darkness at any moment, routines, however absurd, were sacred. A soldier once said, "If I can dry my boots today, it means life still matters." Everything shrank. The entire universe narrowed to the trench you sat in. No sunrises, no stars, only fog and wire, and the heavy smell of men who hadn't washed in weeks. There was a boy who swore he could hear music in the silence. At night, when the shelling stopped, he'd close his eyes and hum the song his sister used to sing at bedtime. That quiet so terrifying and so beautiful was the only peace they ever really had. And then there was the fear of losing even that. One night, William sat beside his best friend in the trench. They were whispering about a dream some absurd. Planned to open a bakery after the war, when a single sniper round cracked the silence, and his friend dropped. No screams, just a soft collapse. The next morning, nothing happened. No shots. No shells. Just the wet murmur of the earth and the thee, dripping of rain. And every soldier looked at each other and said, without saying, "Thank God for nothing." There were no words needed. A glance, a nod, and a heavy exhale were enough. That was their cathedral, an hour where nothing broke. But silence was never safe for long. The wind could carry voices, and sometimes even the trees seemed to whisper. Warnings. So how did they survive those hours? How did they trick their minds into peace when the soul demanded chaos? In the next part, we'll explore the strange rituals, the invented superstitions, and the secret games soldiers played just to stay sane. There were little dances in the dark, coded whispers, lucky objects rubbed smooth by trembling fingers. And every soldier had one small thing in action, an object, a habit that made the boredom bearable and the fear feel far away. But the real story is only just beginning. Let's hear what happened in the moments after the silence. Have you ever wondered why some soldiers in the middle of war, surrounded by bullets, mud, and death, whispered prayers for boredom? Why did they long for the moments when absolutely nothing happened? When the air was thick with damp silence, when the only sound was the drip of water off sandbags and the slosh of wet boots against rotting wooden planks. Maybe you're listening to this late at night, with dim yellow light spilling onto your pillow, or a ceiling fan humming gently above you. Perhaps you're in Lahore, or London, or New York, or simply lying still in a quiet room with nothing but this voice for company. Wherever you are, this is a story designed to drift you into sleep, but not before it pulls you gently into one of the strangest truths of war. That in the trenches of World War II, silence was sacred and boredom was the most precious treasure. Tonight, we're going back to 1943, to a trench carved into the soft, wet earth of a European countryside. The kind of place where time didn't tick, it clung, where the mud smelled of mildew and iron, and every breath felt like sipping fog. In these trenches, young men wrapped themselves in wet blankets, not to keep warm, but to remember that they were still human. And one of them, his name was William, used to say, "I pray nothing happens today. Let us just sit here in this muck with wet socks and heavy coats and no bullets." That prayer, simple as it seems, was more common than gunfire. Soldiers didn't crave glory. They craved a day when the mud stayed quiet, when the sky didn't scream, when the enemy didn't come crawling over the wire. Boredom meant safety. It meant no one died that morning. The trenches were not always places of action. They were mostly places of waiting. Long, stretched-out hours where the only thing to do was scratch at your scalp or count the cracks in the wooden beams above you. Time stopped making sense. Days were no longer remembered as Tuesday or Friday. Instead, soldiers said things like, "The day we got the warm can of beans," or "the night the rat ran across my neck." The rats weren't visitors, they were residents. They chewed through letters from home, nibbled on hard biscuits, and sometimes slept on soldiers' shoulders like tiny furry comrades. One rat became so familiar that the men named him General Whiskers and saved him a crumb of bread each night. These weren't jokes, they were rituals, survival tools. Because in a place where fear lived in your bones, where a scream could burst from the darkness at any moment, routines, however absurd, were sacred. A soldier once said, "If I can dry my boots today, it means life still matters." Everything shrank. The entire universe narrowed to the trench you sat in. No sunrises, no stars, only fog and wire, and the heavy smell of men who hadn't washed in weeks. There was a boy who swore he could hear music in the silence. At night, when the shelling stopped, he'd close his eyes and hum the song his sister used to sing at bedtime. That quiet so terrifying and so beautiful was the only peace they ever really had. And then there was the fear of losing even that. One night, William sat beside his best friend in the trench. They were whispering about a dream some absurd. Planned to open a bakery after the war, when a single sniper round cracked the silence, and his friend dropped. No screams, just a soft collapse. The next morning, nothing happened. No shots. No shells. Just the wet murmur of the earth and the dripping of rain. And every soldier looked at each other and said, without saying, "Thank God for nothing." There were no words needed. A glance, a nod, and a heavy exhale were enough. That was their cathedral, an hour where nothing broke. But silence was never safe for long. The wind could carry voices, and sometimes even the trees seemed to whisper. Warnings. So how did they survive those hours? How did they trick their minds into peace when the soul demanded chaos? In the next part, we'll explore the strange rituals, the invented superstitions, and the secret games soldiers played just to stay sane. There were little dances in the dark, coded whispers, lucky objects rubbed smooth by trembling fingers. And every soldier had one small thing in action, an object, a habit that made the boredom bearable and the fear feel far away. But the real story is only just beginning. Let's hear what happened in the moments after the silence. Sleep. In the trenches was not something you fell into. It was something you earned. Something you had to steal from the chaos. Something you wrapped around yourself like a damp, scratchy blanket, hoping it wouldn't be taken from you too quickly. It rarely came easily. Sleep had to be tricked, coaxed, bribed. And when it did come, it came in strange shape streams without endings, naps without beginnings, moments of unconsciousness that didn't feel like rest, but more like escape. Some soldiers slept sitting up, their knees pulled to their chests, their chins resting on their collarbones, their hands buried in their armpits for warmth. Others would dig small hollows into the trench wall, just deep enough to lean into and drift off against packed earth, their cheeks pressed into mud that still held the day's chill. Most didn't lie down. It was too risky, too cold, too exposed. Lying down meant giving your body to the trench completely, surrendering to its hunger, and many couldn't bring themselves to do it. There was a saying among the men, if the trench lets you sleep, it wants something in return. They weren't wrong. The ground had a way of stealing socks, boots, breath, even sanity. Yet they needed sleep. They needed it more than rations, more than letters from home. Sleep was the one place bullets couldn't follow, the one place silence wasn't terrifying. But getting it was a ritual. First, they'd scrape off what mud they could, sometimes with spoons, sometimes just their fingers. Then they'd roll up socks or old rags into a makeshift pillow. One soldier would hum softly. Another would whisper a prayer. Sometimes a joke would be told delivered not for laughter, but as a lullaby in disguise. And finally, someone would say, "Wake me if I start talking." Because dreams, when they came, were often loud. They weren't dreams of war, those were saved for the waking hours. No, trench dreams were strange things. Men dreamed of things that made no sense. Painting staircases, chasing sheep, tasting strawberries on fire. One man swore he spent an entire dream tying a woman's shoe. Another said he saw his old classroom flooded with soup. No one knew why these images came, but they preferred them to the real memories, the ones of friends gasping, of boots floating in blood, of the screams that didn't always end when the body went still. So they held on to the nonsense. It was softer, safer. There was even a man named Harris who kept a dream log in a small mud-stained notebook. He'd wake, scribble something like floating barn, no roof, cat in uniform, and then go back to sleep. The others teased him at first, but then began sharing their dream fragments, quietly, like secrets. Over time, the log became sacred. When Harris was transferred to another unit, he tore out a page and left it behind just one scribbled line. "Tonight you'll dream of warmth. Trust it." That page was folded and passed around for weeks. But not all sleep was safe. Some nights, the cold would reach so deep into a man's bones that he'd start shaking in his dreams. Others would wake screaming, disoriented, convinced the trench had collapsed or the enemy was climbing over the edge. They called these mud shocks. When it happened, the others wouldn't scold or panic. They'd just sit beside him, offer a hand or a cigarette, and say, "You're still here." That phrase, "you're still here," was code for everything they needed to hear. You're alive. You're not alone. The war hasn't taken you completely. On some nights, sleep came. In shifts, men would take turns resting, while others kept watch. It was a quiet honor system, rarely discussed, but always respected. And sometimes, in those liminal hours between alertness and exhaustion, a kind of dream sharing happened. One man would whisper, "I saw my mother baking," and another would reply, "I saw a river, quiet and wide." They spoke not to impress, but to remember softness. It was a resistance of sorts against the mud, the rot, the endless gray. Some soldiers carried tokens to sleep: a handkerchief, a coin, a pencil stub. One man clutched a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts. Number. One knew why. He never explained. But every night, before closing his eyes, he'd kiss it once and tuck it into his shirt. And when a shell once tore the trench apart, they found him dazed but alive, dirt covering his face, the card still pressed against his chest. "She keeps me safe," he said, and that was all. After that, no one questioned the ritual. It became part of the trench's mythology. And so, sleep was never just sleep. It was hope. It was a rebellion. It was a soft door they could slip through, if only for an hour. But what about those who couldn't sleep? What about the men whose minds wouldn't stop spinning, who lay awake listening to the drip, drip, drip of water from a crack in the trench wall, who counted every heartbeat, every shift of fabric, every cough from a few feet away? In the next part, we'll meet them, the wide-awake soldiers, and learn what they did in the darkest, quietest hours. Some talked to the dead, some recited poetry, some carved tiny statues from bullet casings, and some just stared at the stars, wondering if anyone, anywhere, was dreaming of them. But their story is still waiting in the silence. So let's listen closely and drift one step deeper into the night. There were always those who didn't sleep, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Some said their eyes forgot how to close. Others claimed the trench itself whispered just loud enough to keep them awake. And then there were men like Dawson, who sat cross-legged every night with his back against the trench wall, staring into the dark like he was waiting for someone to return. He never said who. The wide-awake soldiers formed a strange brotherhood, not official, not spoken, but real. They were the ones who kept the trench breathing at night. While others dreamed or shivered or murmured in their sleep, these men listened. They heard everything: the scratch of rats, the soft plunk of dripping water, the creak of worn leather, straps. They became so familiar with the sounds that they could tell who had shifted positions, who had sighed, who had stopped snoring, and when someone's breath stopped completely. Dawson once said, "You learn a man by his sleep." I've known men I never spoke to, just by the rhythm of their dreams. To stay awake wasn't bravery. It was survival in another form. For some, sleep was a risk too large. What if the enemy crept close? What if the wall gave way? What if the rats chewed through something important? But for others, it was fear that kept them open-eyed. Not fear of death, but fear of memory. Dreams were unreliable. They opened old wounds, replayed old scenes with cruel clarity. So instead, the wakeful kept their minds busy. They counted the stars, at least, the ones that sometimes peeked through the fog. One soldier swore he saw a shooting star and made a wish that his boots would dry. Another laughed softly and said he wished for jam. A third said nothing, just stared at the sky until his eyes filled with tears. In one sector, a soldier began carving tiny figures out of bullet casings, little animals, birds, even a woman's silhouette. He called it trench whittling. At first, it was a hobby, then it became a legend. Men from neighboring posts came to see his latest creation. They'd sit silently, watching his knife work, hypnotized by the slow dance of metal, shaving against metal. The tiny figures became charms, carried in pockets, hung from wires, hidden in boots. One was shaped like a bear, and the man who carried it claimed he survived a sniper shot because of it. Was it true? No one cared. The story was what mattered. It helped pass the hours between midnight and dawn, the hours when time seemed to stall. Poetry also lived in the trenches, strange as it may seem. One man, an older recruit named Leonard, had memorized hundreds of lines. He recited softly to himself, barely a whisper, but those near him listened. He didn't choose war poems or anything about glory. No, Leonard recited verses about rivers, old trees, falling leaves, and quiet gardens. Words that felt like places. One night, as he whispered something about autumn wind through apple orchards, the entire trench seemed to still. Even the rats paused. Someone said, "You make me remember things I never lived." And Leonard smiled. That was his gift. Meanwhile, others created rituals. A soldier named Gray carried a small stone-smooth, oval, pale gray, like his name. Each night, he'd turn it over in his hand exactly 20 times, then place it under his helmet. "It keeps the dreams out," he'd explain, and no one laughed. Rituals, however odd, were treated with respect. Everyone had one. A folded sock, a bent spoon, a button sewn into the sleeve just so. Superstition in the trenches wasn't childish, it was sacred. It was how men built control in a place where nothing could be controlled. And in those long hours, new rituals were invented. One soldier tied a string from one wrist to the other, claiming it balanced his thoughts. Another dabbed tobacco under his nose like perfume before sleep. A third, who had once been a painter, drew imaginary paintings in the air with his finger each stroke slow and careful. "This one's a church," he'd murmur, "with stained glass windows, no blood in it." Not all the wide-awake moments were peaceful. Sometimes men whispered to the dead. They would murmur apologies, or tell old jokes, or ask questions into the dark. They didn't expect answers. It was enough to speak. One soldier swore he saw his brother killed 6 months earlier, standing just outside the trench, arms folded, grinning. He didn't scream. He just nodded and said, "It's okay," and the ghost vanished. After that, he carved a notch in the trench wall. Every night he didn't see him. The others didn't ask what the notches meant. They just let him keep counting. And sometimes, those who couldn't sleep simply sat beside each other, wordless. Just presence, the comfort of knowing someone else was awake. In one trench, they called it the silent watch. Men would rotate in pairs, sitting shoulder to shoulder, watching nothing, guarding nothing, simply existing in stillness. It was more effective than any order barked by a sergeant. No one ever missed their turn, because the trench at night was a different world. It wasn't just a hole in the earth. It was a place of suspended time, where fears became fog, and the smallest acts became sacred. Lighting a match, tucking a letter under a helmet, pressing a thumb to a lucky token. These were not meaningless habits. They were the stitches that kept sanity from unraveling. But what of the mornings? When gray light crept in and the world returned? What did it mean? To wake up in a place where survival was a surprise? In the next part, we'll rise with the soldiers, see what the first moments of daylight felt like in the trenches. What routines began the day? What hopes, if any, survived the night? But for now, listen to the stillness. Somewhere, someone is carving a tiny bird in the dark. Somewhere, someone is counting stars. And somewhere, someone is whispering the name of the one they lost at dawn. And the trenches didn't break like a sunrise. It seeped, gray and slow, like a bruise spreading across the sky. No roosters were crowing, no warm beams of light stretching through curtains. Instead, the morning arrived as a shift in coldness, a soft difference in the color of mud, a faint change in how the fog hung between the wires. The soldiers didn't stretch or yawn like men waking from rest. They stirred cautiously, like animals emerging from a hole, sniffing the air for danger before moving even a finger. Someone would rustle first a cough, a groan, the quiet hiss of boots against wood as a body shifted to sitting. Then another would sit up, rubbing his face with stiff hands, pulling on a helmet that had become as much a part of him as his skin. The unspoken rule was simple. No one moved fast. Quick motions. Startled, sudden energy felt foreign. Mornings were approached with reverence, as if to admit that yes, somehow we're still alive. The ritual began with small things. A tin cup lifted slowly. A match struck, trying not to snap. A spoon clinking against a mess tin in the softest rhythm. The first light meal was hardly a meal at all, maybe a biscuit softened by breath, maybe a bit of corned beef chewed without joy. But even in this meager act, there was ceremony. One man always shared his first bite with a rat he'd named Oscar, holding out a crumb like an offering. "It's rent," he said, for sleeping in his house. No one laughed anymore. Oscar had lived there longer than most of them. The act of grooming, if you could call it, that came next. Some wiped their faces with muddy handkerchiefs. Others ran fingers through their hair or across their jawlines just to remind themselves they still had a face. There was a mirror, cracked and warped, hanging from a nail hammered into the trench wall. Men lined up to glimpse themselves in it, one after another, staring not in vanity but in disbelief. "Still me," one whispered each morning, as if surprised. Another man kissed his reflection lightly, then laughed under his breath. "Just to feel like someone's touched me," he muttered. Toothbrushing was rare but precious. A few lucky ones still had bristles on theirs, while others used cloth or simply rubbed with fingers dipped in tea. Soap was almost mythical when it appeared, passed around like contraband. It made everything smell like home for a minute. A man named Tobin once received a small bar wrapped in paper. He didn't use it. He kept it in his breast pocket and took it out each morning just to sniff. "It smells like 1939, he'd say, eyes closed. The latrines were nothing more than holes with wooden planks over them, but even there, rituals emerged. Men gave each other privacy, not with walls, but with silence. No talking, no eye contact, just a quiet understanding that dignity, even in mud, mattered. And then came the check. Every man, whether conscious of it or not, took inventory of his body, toes, fingers, knees, ears. Anything swollen? Anything missing? A cut that might have festered overnight? The cold could hide damage, so they looked carefully. A soldier named Mikkel once woke up unable to feel his foot. He took off his boot and saw his toes had turned gray. Without saying a word, he lit a cigarette and stared at them. When someone asked if he was okay, he simply nodded and said, "They were slow dancers. Took too long to keep up." No one said more. That day, his friends carried him piggyback to the medic, humming softly to drown out the pain. The morning also brought mail sometimes. A sack dropped in by a runner, mud-covered, with envelopes stained and torn. Men would gather around, eyes hungry, names called out one by one. Some days, no letters came. Some men never received any. One soldier tore off the return address of a friend's letter and wrote to that stranger's mother, pretending to be her son's trenchmate. "He talks about you," he wrote. "Says your apple pie could cure trench foot." It was a lie, but a gentle one. The letter brought a package weeks later for homemade cookies, each wrapped in wax paper. They were broken and stale, but the men split them like communion wafers. At times, they would play a game in the morning called If I Weren't Here. Each man would name what he'd be doing if the war had never happened. One would say, "Fishing with my father." Another would say, "Fixing bikes in the alley behind my house." A third, more quietly, would say sleeping in my bed with clean sheets and no boots. It wasn't wishing. It wasn't complaining. It was remembering. As the day unfolded, boredom became armor again. After the morning rituals, there was always work to be done, though it was less about purpose and more about motion. Repacking, sandbags, reinforcing the walls, cleaning weapons that had already been cleaned, sharpening knives that had never been used, a way to move the hands so the mind wouldn't wander. And yet, every man knew that this rhythm, the slow, gray pulse of a trench morning, could shatter in an instant. One shout, one whistle, one sound like thunder cracking too close. So they cherished the routine, the dullness. A day that began with boredom meant they might have a night to survive. But how did they keep the cycle going? How did they hold on to humanity in this place where dawn came not with sunlight, but with mud? In the next part, we'll explore how soldiers kept their identities, how they reminded themselves of who they were before the uniform, before the trench, before the war, through tiny acts, whispered names, worn-out photographs, and rituals, passed from one set of muddy hands to another. But for now, let the trench breathe, slow and quiet. Morning has broken not like a hymn, but like a fragile promise, whispered into cold fog dot in a world of identical uniforms, shaved heads and synchronized orders, remembering who you were before the trench became its form of resistance. Identity, in the trenches, wasn't maintained through bold declarations or grand speeches. It lived in whispers, habits, and the most ordinary objects. A man might be known not by his name, but by the way he tied his boots, by the song he hummed while cleaning his rifle, or by the smell of cloves from a pouch tucked deep in his coat. There was a boy named Sinclair who folded every letter he received into a perfect triangle before tucking it into his sleeve. He never read them in front of anyone. Instead, each night before sleep, he would unfold just one corner, as if peeling back time in fractions. Others carried old photographs creased, fading, some almost rubbed blank by the constant pressure of fingers, but they still held meaning. A girl in a summer dress, a mother holding a baby, a group of boys smiling in front of a car. These images weren't just memories. They were proof. Proof that life had once existed outside of this trench, that somewhere there had been clean roads, open windows, mornings without fear. One man, Reuben, didn't have a photograph. Instead, he had a button small, pale blue, chipped on one side. From my sister's dress, he'd explain, tapping it twice before putting it back into the lining of his coat. He never wore it, just touched it like a ritual. Then there was Anders, a carpenter before the war, who carried a pencil behind. His ear even when he wasn't writing. It was broken, unsharpened, and mostly useless, but it was his. Just to remind myself, my hands once built things, he said. And when he wasn't reinforcing trench walls or carving initials into his tin cup, he would gesture with the pencil as if sketching blueprints in the air. These small details, half-lost names, weathered mementos were anchors in the slow sinking fog of identity loss. The trench had a way of grinding men down into function. Shooter, digger, lookout, number. But in these quiet tokens, individuality flickered like a match in the wind, and even names had to be protected. In some places, men didn't call each other by their surnames or ranks. They used nicknames from before the war. Chickpea, boots, piano fingers, apple, beans. Strange, affectionate names that carried flavors of home. Sometimes a man would only respond to that name and ignore anything else, as if shedding his official title helped keep his real self alive. Language was another thread of selfhood. In multilingual units, soldiers would whisper in their mother tongues when they thought no one was listening, snippets of lullabies, scoldings from long-dead grandmothers, jokes only funny in one dialect. It didn't matter whether the others understood. Just saying the words, letting them hang in the trench air, was an act of return. A man named Leo used to speak to his boots in Yiddish. "New, you going to leak again today?" He'd grumble, then pat the toe like an old friend. There was humor in these moments, gentle and strange. It reminded the men that they were more than mud-covered ghosts. Even smells became part of identity. Tobacco from a particular province. The faint almond scent of a soap bar hoarded for weeks. A dried orange peel kept in a tin, open now and then for a single breath of sweetness. One soldier kept a sprig of rosemary in his pocket. "It's for remembering," he said simply. No one asked more. Stories helped, too. The act of telling, not about the war, but about before. One night, under a thin drizzle, a circle of men sat trading tales of the oddest jobs they'd ever worked. One had been a chimney sweep at 14. Another, a piano tuner's assistant who couldn't play a single note. A third claimed to have caught eels for a living, using only his bare hands. They laughed softly, not to forget where they were, but to remember who they'd been. Sometimes the stories were shared one-on-one, in the pauses between shifts or during the long wait for rations. A young man named Eli would quietly tell the same story every few nights to different people, always slightly different. It was about his dog, Sasha, who had followed him everywhere and once rescued a neighbor's cat from a frozen pond. The story changed. Sometimes the pond was deep, sometimes shallow. Sometimes Sasha barked like a hero. Other times she whimpered. But always, Eli ended with the same line. "She waited by the gate every day, even after I left." It didn't matter if it was true. What mattered was the telling. Holding on to identity also meant small rebellions against uniformity. A soldier stitched a red thread to the inside of his collar. Another always folded his blanket in a diamond instead of a square. One wore mismatched socks on purpose. These were invisible revolts against becoming no one. And in some places, men traded keepsakes, tokens of identity shared like whispers. A pebble was swapped for a button. A playing card tucked into a helmet strap. A tiny carved fish was handed from one hand to another in silence. These exchanges didn't need explanation. The objects weren't valuable, but they were full of meaning. Carrying someone else's token meant carrying their story, their hope, their proof of existence. Even writing your name became sacred. There was a wooden board nailed to one trench wall, carved over with dozens of initials. No one knew who started it, but every man who passed through added his mark. Some wrote full names, others just initials. One carved a heart. Another drew a bicycle. One left only a fingerprint, pressed in grease. And when the trench flooded and the board was lost, someone found another plank and started again. Identity, after all, wasn't about being remembered by the world. It was about not forgetting yourself. But what happens when that thread frays? Too thin? When even your name feels like a borrowed sound? In the next part, we'll explore the quieter breakdowns and moments when identity slipped away, when men forgot their voices, when silence became a hiding place from who they once were. But for now, let these memories sit with us. Let the old pencil, the blue button, the orange peel, the scent of rosemary, let them remind us that even in mud, even in war, the soul kept whispering, "I am still here." There were days when even the smallest thread of identity began to fray, when a man would forget the sound of his voice or doubt the shape of his name. Not because he had taken a blow to the head or lost his senses entirely, but because the trench had eaten too many pieces of him. It didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, subtly, like fog creeping in through a cracked window. First came the silence, not the silence of the trench itself, but the silence inside the man. He'd stop speaking unless spoken to. Then even when spoken to, he'd just nod. His eyes would follow movement, but not fully. He'd react to loud noises, but only with a blink. The others would notice, but they wouldn't say anything. They understood. They'd seen it before. There was a name for it, though no one liked to say it aloud. Ghosting. It didn't mean someone had died. It meant they'd become someone else. Not mad, not broken, just emptied. A man named Fletcher stopped answering to his name. Entirely. One day, someone called out to him twice, loudly, and he didn't turn. But when another soldier tapped him and said, "Hey, Apple," the nickname they'd given him months ago, Fletcher blinked and whispered, "Yes." It was like watching someone return from a place no one else could see. Sometimes it was the mud that took it out of them. The endless scraping, waiting, sitting in filth. One man, Leonard, simply stopped cleaning himself. He didn't resist or complain, he just let it happen. His clothes stiffened, his face grayed, and he started humming a single note for hours. When asked why, he said he was trying to remember. A song from before. He couldn't recall the words, or the melody, or even where he'd heard it, just the feeling. The feeling of being someone who wasn't here. Another soldier wrote his name over and over on the inside of a ration box. When asked, he said, "I just want to be sure it's still mine." And still others tried to hold on to identity with fierceness, to the point of snapping. A boy of 17 called Little Jack used to recite his birthday every morning. Like a prayer. October 8th, 1925. October 8th, 1925. One day, someone teased him for it, lightly, playfully. Jack didn't respond. That night, he sat awake, eyes wide, and when asked what he was doing, he said, "Making sure I don't disappear." No one teased him again. Losing yourself in the trench didn't mean you screamed, or ran, or collapsed. Most of the time, it meant you became very still, too still. You stopped adjusting your blanket. You stopped laughing at the half-jokes. You stopped saying thank you when someone passed you food. A man would sit like that for hours, days even, until someone nudged him back into the present. There was a method for that, unspoken, but known. First came warmth. A hand on the shoulder, a jacket wrapped around him. Then came sound, someone humming softly the beginning of a lullaby. Then came memory. Remember when we found that chocolate bar? Remember the candle? The bird? That stupid bet you made about climbing the crate? And slowly, the ghost would blink, breathe, nod. It didn't always work. Some ghosts stayed. A soldier named Branson stopped speaking after a shell killed 3 of his friends mid-conversation. One day, he was laughing, and the next, nothing. He listened, moved, and obeyed orders, but his voice was gone. No injury, just silence. Men tried to reach him with stories, jokes, and even letters from home. One soldier read Branson his letter aloud, hoping to coax something out. "Your sister says the dog still howls when the train passes," he whispered. Branson didn't move. Not then. But 2 nights later, someone heard him murmur, "I miss that dog." That was all. But it was enough to start sewing the threads back together. Sometimes music helped. There was a harmonica passed through the trenches like a relic. No one knew whose it was anymore. But it was played, softly, at dusk. The same broken tune, the same 5 notes. Men would hum along. They didn't know. The song didn't care. It was something human, something shaped. Not the random noise of war, but the deliberate sound of someone choosing to be alive. And if a man started humming, even barely, it meant he hadn't disappeared entirely. Objects helped too. One soldier found an old rusted watch buried in the mud. The glass was gone, the hands broken, but he wound it each morning anyway. just so I remember how," he said. He didn't care that it didn't tick. The act was the point. Others braided threads into their shoelaces or scratched poetry into their tin plates. One man carved a perfect spiral into a wooden spoon and ran his thumb along it each night before sleep. It was a map, he said, of how to get back to himself. But perhaps the strangest ritual belonged to a soldier named Elias, who every morning spoke to himself in the third person. Elias is going to stand up now. Elias is going to drink. Elias is not going to cry. He did it without shame. And when asked why, he smiled faintly and said, "So I don't forget, I'm still someone." The trench didn't erase men all at once. It wore them down grain by grain, memory by memory, until even their reflections seemed like strangers. But in small ways, through scent, sound, touch, rhythm, they clawed pieces of themselves back. And what about the friendships? The ones that helped men hold on to who they were? In the next part, we'll explore the quiet, unspoken brotherhoods formed in the trenches, the deep bonds built not from grand gestures, but from shared socks, exchanged glances, and the trust that someone would wake you when it was your turn to dream. But tonight, let the voices echo gently. Let the ghosts sit, but not stay. Let the harmonica play its broken tune, and let a name, just one name, float softly into the fog, waiting to be answered. In the trenches, friendship didn't begin with grand introductions or handshakes. It began with silence, and what followed afterward. It began with someone handing you a dry sock when yours were soaked through, with someone nudging their last biscuit toward you without saying a word, with someone shifting closer in the cold night without comment. These were not the kind of friendships that needed labels or loud declarations. They were built of fragments, shared glances, quiet nods, fingers brushing against fingers as two men passed a match back and forth. It was in these moments that trust formed, not the kind of trust forged in battle, but the softer, slower kind, built during long hours of boredom, fear, and waiting. There was a pair, Matteo and Price, who became almost one person in the eyes of the others. They spoke little, but they mirrored each other's movements like dancers rehearsing without music. When Matteo leaned his head back against the wall, Price did too. When Price hummed, Matteo tapped the beat on his thigh. They didn't share stories. They shared space. And in the trench, that was the highest intimacy. You didn't ask a man his past if he didn't offer it. But if he lent you his spoon or sat with you through a bad dream, you knew what mattered. One night, during a downpour, the trench began to flood. The walls groaned under the weight of water, and the floor turned into a thick stew of filth and rain. In the chaos, Matteo's boot was sucked off by the mud. He cursed, reached down, and lost his balance. Before he could fall, Price grabbed his collar and held him up. Later, when asked about it, Price said simply, he'd have done the same. No one doubted it. Friendship wasn't about what you said. It was about what you did when no one was watching. Another pair, Ellis and Jawad, came from opposite ends of the empire. One from rural England, the other from a small village tucked into the valleys of northern India. They spoke in fragments of shared language, switching between gestures, borrowed words, and a strange blend of rhythm and sound. Yet they understood each other perfectly. Ellis once burned his hand lighting a cigarette with wet fingers, and Jawad, without hesitation, tore a strip from his undershirt, dipped it in cooling tea, and wrapped it carefully. After that, they passed a folded piece of cloth back and forth. Every few days a napkin, a rag, a kerchief, something always smelling faintly of mint and ash. It became their language. "You okay?" meant a touch on the shoulder. "I miss home" was a shared sip from a cracked canteen. "Don't die" was silence, pressed long and heavy as they stared into the fog together. Some friendships formed and ended without fanfare. A soldier would arrive, new and unsure, be folded into the rhythm of the trench, and just when he'd found his place, his sleeping spot, his rituals, his trenchmate, he'd be gone. Sometimes a sniper, sometimes reassigned, sometimes simply disappeared into the maze of command, and the ones left behind would feel it like a bruise they couldn't explain. A cup would go unclaimed. A spot by the fire would remain empty longer than usual, and no one would speak of it. Because grief in the trench wasn't loud, it was quiet and persistent, like damp creeping into cloth. Some friendships were more tender than the world outside would have allowed. A touch lingering longer than necessary. A whispered story shared. Only once, at night, beneath a blanket. In the trench, where death sat inches from your skin, love took strange forms. It wasn't about passion or labels. It was about comfort, closeness, trust. Two men sleeping shoulder to shoulder, one pressing his foot against the other's to remind him he wasn't alone. A stolen smile in the early morning light. A letter written in code that no one else would understand. The socks are holding. Up, the fireflies were bright last night. I dreamed of the orchard again. And the recipient, upon reading, would smile. Because the orchard wasn't real. It was a word they'd chosen for a place they imagined together. Green, quiet, always. Just beyond reach. They promised to meet there someday. Not when the war ended. Just someday. Not all friendships survived. Stress frayed nerves. Hunger brought out tempers. Misunderstandings turned into shouts, and sometimes fists. But more often, there was forgiveness. Not spoken aloud, but offered in the form of sitting close again, of sharing the last cigarette, of letting the past dissolve in the next rain. One soldier, Mac, had a notebook where he wrote down the names of every man he considered a friend. He never showed it to anyone. But when he was killed in a sudden shell burst, the notebook was found in his coat. It had dozens of names, some crossed out, most not. At the very back was a single line, "I didn't forget you." It was signed with just an M. His trenchmates didn't say much after. They just passed the notebook around, and each man touched the page with 2 fingers. Friendship also meant protection in more subtle ways. Keeping a man from doing something foolish. Sitting with him when his letters stopped arriving. Trading rations so he could have his favorite. Defending him in front of a superior without asking why. Holding him while he sobbed into your coat. Carrying his gear when he couldn't walk anymore. And when he died burying him with his socks folded properly, his buttons jacket smoothed. Down, a token slipped into his hand. They didn't cry, not then, but they remembered. And that memory became the bond that held the trench together. These weren't battlefield heroics. These were the quiet loyalties built in moments the world would never record. And perhaps that was the strangest thing, how the trench, designed to dehumanize, instead revealed the deepest forms of care. In the next part, we'll look at the strange objects soldiers created together. Trench art, carved tokens, coded messages, and collaborative rituals that acted like memory vaults. But for now, imagine 2 men sitting side by side, sharing this same blanket, the same breath, and the same silence. Not needing to speak to be understood. When everything around you is mud, wire, and whispers of death, the hands start to crave creation. In the silence between shellings and the hours between watches, when the brain had grown too tired of remembering and too weary of sleep, soldiers began to make things not out of beauty, not even out of hope, but out of the deep, aching need. To turn fear into form. Trench art, they called it later. But in the moment, it wasn't art, it was survival. It was keeping the fingers busy so the heart didn't fall apart. Men carved bullets into birds, coins into pendants, tin scraps into crosses, stars, initials, tiny knives with blades that would never cut. They hammered designs into mess tins with boot nails. They twisted wire into rings and bracelets, and once, even a perfect miniature violin, no longer than a thumb. These objects weren't just hobbies. They were anchors, tokens of selfhood, talismans. Against forgetting. One soldier, Cohen, carved a chest set out of soap. He used buttons for bases and kept them in a cigarette box lined with torn fabric. The pawns were worn from use. The queen was chipped, but each piece had personality. He and his trenchmates would play slow, careful games that stretched across days. When shells fell, they'd scoop up the board and tuck it away, only to resume. The next day, as if nothing had interrupted. Check, someone would whisper, gently, like a prayer. Another soldier, Jan from Estonia, was a metal worker before the war. He fashioned a tiny spinning top from a brass casing and balanced it so finely that it would spin for over a minute on the flat surface of a helmet. Watching it turn became a ritual men would gather to see whose wish it would land nearest. If the top stopped pointing at you, it meant luck. If it pointed straight at you, it meant you were next for latrine duty. It was superstition. Yes, but wrapped in laughter. Laughter that didn't disturb the sleep of the trench, but warmed it. Like a small fire. There was also the ritual of the secret messages. Men passed notes to each other, folded into elaborate shapes, birds, boats, hearts, stars. They weren't official reports or strategy. They were fragments of dreams, inside jokes, bits of poetry. One soldier folded a letter to his friend in the shape of a fish and wrote inside, "Still swimming. Water's muddy. Hope you are too." Another sent a paper heart to a man, 3 posts down, that simply read, "Red sky at morning, but you're still glowing." These gestures weren't romantic in the usual sense, but in the trench, everything tender became sacred. And the coded. Language grew. Stars meant hunger. Teeth meant fear. A drawing of a chair meant someone was too tired to speak. Even stones had meaning. If you found a white stone in your boot, it meant someone was thinking of you. It was a strange alphabet of shared survival. And sometimes, objects were made not to keep but to bury. A group of men created a time capsule out of a biscuit tin. Inside, they placed a match, a carved spoon, a dried flower sent from someone's sister, a coin, and a single dog tag from a man who had died the week before. They buried it in the wall of the trench, just deep enough to disappear. "So someone will know we were here," they said. No one ever dug it back up. And in a way, that was the point. Not all trench art was pretty. Some was strange, even haunting. One man stitched a face into his glove, 2 buttons for eyes, a thread mouth curved into a grin. He spoke to it every morning. "Still here?" he'd ask. The glove never answered. Another soldier painted pictures on the inside of his helmet, using a mix of candle wax and ash. Scenes of rivers, trees, boats, and once, a man standing on a cliff looking out over the ocean. When asked what it meant, he simply replied, "He's waiting for himself to come home." These quiet acts of making were not about passing time. They were about claiming time, bending it, shaping it, turning long stretches of terror into something tactile. Every object told a story, even broken ones. A snapped pencil was kept in. A sock is a reminder of a joke someone once made. A torn photograph was folded into a ring. A bottle cap became an earring. A piece of a broken shovel blade was sanded into the shape of a tooth. These weren't keepsakes, they were incantations. Proof that even in this place, the human spirit still knew how to shape meaning. And when men traded these things, it wasn't barter, it was communion. "You carry this now," someone would say, handing over a carved wooden star. "Just until you're back." No one asked what back meant. It didn't matter. The gesture did. The act of placing something made by one set of hands into another set warm, shaking, calloused, cold that was the real exchange. And some objects never left the trench. They were left behind, hung on wires, tucked into corners, balanced atop. Broken crates, a horseshoe with initials scratched into it, a piece of mirror mounted in the mud, a spoon planted like a flag, markers not of battle, but of breath. So if ever someone passed through later, they would know someone lived here. Someone felt. Someone made something despite everything. And in the next part, we'll see how soldiers turned the act of waiting into a rhythm, how the hours themselves became something to craft, to mark, to transform. But for now, imagine one man hunched in the dark, his fingers shaping a scrap of metal into a tiny dove. Behind him, someone hums. Beside him, someone sleeps. And in his hands, something silent and small is being born into the mud. Time in the trenches had no real structure. There were no clocks that mattered, no sunrises bright enough to mark morning from noon, no proper meals to break up the day. And so the soldiers began to invent their rhythm, an unofficial, handmade clock built from gestures, habits, murmurs, and glances. They didn't follow minutes or hours. They followed motions. A man was lighting his first cigarette of the day and was morning. The soft clatter of tin cups was midday. The second yawn from the same soldier meant it was time to prepare for dusk. They didn't call it evening or nightfall. They called it the dimming, and every man knew exactly what it meant. The dimming wasn't about light. It was about hush. Voices softened. Movements slowed. Letters were tucked away, half-written. Boots were loosened, but not removed. Men folded their coats tighter, lit their last match, and took one long breath, as if preparing for something to come, not necessarily danger, but a change in the fabric of the day. This rhythm was sacred. Even the rats obeyed it, scurrying more, slowly, almost politely. And so began what they called the slow hours, that strange stretch between eating and sleeping, between preparing and surviving. These hours were both dull and sacred. They were when stories were shared, never the loud ones, never the ones about battles of bravery, but the quiet ones. The stories of fishing trips that ended in rain, of favorite windowsills, of the way. Bread used to smell in a certain kitchen at a certain hour. There was a soldier, Toma, who told the same story every evening, about the tree in his childhood backyard that used to bloom too early, and how the frost always came and killed the blossoms. That's how you know spring's here, he'd say. When the second bloom survives, no one cared if it was true. It became the marker of the fifth hour, just after soup, just before pipe smoke. Others used touch to mark time. A tap on the shoulder meant 10 minutes to patrol. A shared blanket meant 1 hour until sleep. The passing of a small stone, warm from someone's pocket, meant nothing but was understood as the signal. You may rest now. Some created invisible schedules. One man always walked the same 10 steps at what would have been sunset, hands behind, his back like a headmaster in a school hallway. Another always whispered a name at the same point each day, just after the soup cooled, but before the stars emerged. Marta, he'd say. No one asked who she was. That was the 6th hour, and as the sky darkened into a deeper gray, never black, just thick fog layered over a deeper silence, some men would begin to hum. It wasn't planned. One voice would rise, barely audible, then another would join. Different songs in different keys, like a drifting orchestra tuning before a concert they'd never play. It made no sense, musically, but emotionally it felt like a lullaby stitched from the throats of men who'd long forgotten lullabies. Even the officers didn't interrupt it. The hum was part of the clock. There was also the sharing of the last thing, a ritual so subtle you might miss it if you weren't watching. A last biscuit halved. A tin passed one more time. A cigarette stub was offered without a word. This was the 8th hour. The hour of gesture, when men said everything without speaking. Take this, meant I see you. You need it more, meant I'm still here. We'll be okay, meant nothing, but was said anyway, in silence. And just before sleep, when the dimming reached its softest pitch, men began the final rituals. Socks were wrung out, whether they'd be dry or not. Helmets were turned upside down to catch the night's drizzle. Weapons were checked not for battle, but for comfort, for routine. One soldier rubbed his rifle like a prayer bead, his hands moving slowly, eyes half closed. Another folded his hands behind his head and whispered to the air, "If I see the moon, I'll dream of grass." There was no moon, but he dreamed anyway. The men called these final minutes the gray fold, as if the sky itself were tucking. "Am in." And in these minutes, stories stopped. Movement ceased. Even the rats grew still, as if listening for something just beyond hearing. And then someone, always someone, would whisper, "Tomorrow, we do it again." Not a complaint, not a hope, just a marking of the time, an anchor thrown into the void to stop the mind from drifting too far into the night. Time in the trenches didn't move forward. It circled, looped, sank, and the men, day by day, learned how to live inside that strange clock. But what happened when something shattered the rhythm, when the unexpected broke through and the loop was broken? In the next part, we'll explore those ruptures. The sudden blasts in the middle of a story, the silence cut by a scream, the moments when the trench forgot what hour it was, and time collapsed into noise. But for now, let the rhythm hold. Let the cigarette pass. Let the hum rise and fall. Let the clock of quiet men mark its slow heartbeat against the earth. There were moments in the trench when the fragile rhythm cracked when a loop of silence, repetition, and ritual was sliced open by something sudden, something loud, something sharp enough to remind every man that this was still a war. These were not the moments of planned attack or expected shelling. Those had their strange cadence. No, the real terror came in the unannounced ruptures, when time forgot to warn you. 1 second, a man would be sipping cold tea, staring at his boots, thinking about nothing at all, and the next thunder. Not sky thunder, but earth thunder, the kind that rises from the ground and shakes your ribs from the inside. The kind that drops you mid-sentence. A sudden shell, unexpected, dropped too close. A sharp crack of a sniper's bullet breaking the air. Still air. A screamed human, unmistakable, ripping across the trench like a blade. These were the moments that couldn't be stitched into the daily rhythm. They didn't belong. They were intrusions, and every man knew that one could come at any time. There was no defense against them, except silence and stillness. When a shell hit too near, time didn't slow. It vanished. There was a flash of sound, a displacement of air, and then the silence after was not peaceful but stunned. Men blinked and looked at one another, touched their limbs as if counting them, glanced around to check who was missing, who was on the ground, who was no longer moving. No one spoke immediately. Words took time to return. They came later, halting, and sometimes never. A soldier named Finn once stood to stretch, just for a second, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a bullet found his temple. He fell, without a sound, as if he'd simply chosen to lie down. The man beside him, Jules, reached out, not with urgency, but with disbelief. He touched Finn's shoulder, then his own, and looked at the sky. "Just like that?" he whispered. "Number." One answered. They buried Finn with his socks folded and a carved pebble in his pocket. Afterward, Jules didn't speak for 3 days. 3 days. Not from shock exactly, but from reverence. The silence was his way of filling the rupture. The unpredictability of these moments made the soldiers superstitious. Some began small rituals before doing anything that might tempt fate. tapping, a beam before stepping out, whispering a name before unwrapping a ration. One man always took 3 breaths before relieving himself. Another never read his letters until after nightfall. Bad news is shy, he said. It likes the dark. Sudden death turned objects into sacred relics. A broken comb left behind became an heirloom. A spoon with initials scratched into it became a shrine. Once, after a shell hit close and took out 2 men in the far corner of the trench, the others waited hours before going to that side again. Not from fear, but from respect. When they finally went, they found a half-finished drawing of a tree, scratched into the wall with a nail. The branches trailed off into nothing. Someone added leaves with the tip of a bayonet. They didn't know who started it. It became known as the tree that never grew. Some ruptures came not from outside, but from within. A man would suddenly break. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once. He'd be sitting still, then begin to shake and scream, not words, just noise, and try to claw his uniform as if it were burning. Others would hold him down gently, wrap their arms around him, whisper whatever came to mind. Names, stories, nonsense. It's just thunder, one man said as he rocked another who was sobbing. It's just the sky clearing its throat. When the fit passed, the man would sleep deeply, and when he woke, nothing would be said. That was part of the trench's code. Breakdowns were sacred, not shameful. Another rupture was mail, specifically bad mail. Letters with black edges. Letters with nothing inside but a name and a date. One soldier received such a letter and folded it carefully, then placed it into the dirt beside his boot. He didn't cry. Instead, he said, "She died before knowing I came here." For weeks, he carried a pencil and wrote her name in the margins of every object he could find. His belt, his canteen, the inside of his helmet. So she exists here too, he explained. One day, someone took the helmet and wrote her name larger, in bold strokes, so others would see. Another way of saying, you are not forgotten. Not all interruptions were cruel. Sometimes, someone would burst into laughter sudden, sharp, absurd. Like the time a rat stole a soldier's biscuit, and he chased it with his boot, shouting, "Give it back, thief! I earned that." Or the time someone slipped and fell into the latrine and emerged covered in mud and curses, and even the sergeant couldn't hold back a grin. These breaks were welcome. There were ruptures in the other, direction toward life. And when one man laughed, others followed, cautiously, then louder, until the whole trench seemed to chuckle like a giant, trying not to wake a sleeping child. But whether the rupture was tragic or comic, it always left a mark. Afterward, there was a pause, a reset, a rebuilding of rhythm. The socks folded again. The cups are cleaned. The humming restarted. A story retold as if it had never been told before. The second bloom survives, Toma would say again, and this time the others nodded more slowly, because they knew how fragile that bloom was. In the next part, we'll return to the night specifically, the night watches. The way soldiers stood in the dark, guarding not just the trench, but the quiet. We'll walk beside them in those long hours when fear and imagination kept pace. But for now, let the silence hold. Let the rupture settle like dust. Let the trench breathe again, slowly, as if exhaling the memory of sudden noise. Night watch in the trenches was unlike any other task. It wasn't a shift, it was a descent into a strange, stretched out kind of awareness, where the body grew still and the mind started walking on its own. Assigned in pairs or alone, depending on the mood of the moment, men would rise when the theons dimming had deepened, strap on their rifles, and take their place near the lip of the trench or at one of the saps, those narrow extensions, like fingers reaching toward enemy lines. The world by then had turned silver gray, every shadow taller than it should be, every sound louder, every breath visible. Most watches lasted an hour or two, but time lost its grip quickly. 5 minutes could feel like a season. In those long, still stretches, the trench took on a new kind of personality. By day, it was a home muddy and makeshift, but familiar. At night, it was something else, a beast you had to soothe. It creaked and sighed, dripped and groaned. The wooden boards would settle suddenly, and the earth would shift as if remembering something. The wind found its way down through the broken sandbags and kissed your face with the breath of forgotten rain. You listened, not just for enemies, but for ghosts. The quiet ones who brushed past your boots or leaned too close without warning. Every soldier, at some point, swore he saw something that wasn't there. A figure in the fog, a movement at the corner of his eye, a voice just beyond the reach of understanding. One man named Lyle said he once heard a lullaby in French drifting over the trench wall. Another swore he smelled his mother's apple pie carried on the breeze. They didn't question it. The night was allowed its mysteries. It was said, half seriously, that if you stared into the dark long enough, the dark stared back, and it didn't always recognize you. Some soldiers whispered to themselves during watch, not to keep alert, but to keep present. 1, 2, 1, 2. They'd murmur, or recite poems, or sing under their breath. Others made lists of favorite meals, of faces they'd seen, of books they'd read. One soldier wrote letters in his mind long, sprawling things he'd never put to paper. Dear Father, he'd think, I finally understand why you fixed the fence alone. I would have helped if I'd known it mattered. Then he'd look up and scan the trench edge again, fingers tight on the rifle, waiting. The greatest enemy during watch wasn't the other side, it was the sudden, creeping thought that maybe nothing was real anymore. Maybe you'd always been here. Maybe the war was just the outside shape of your mind, playing itself out over and over. That's when the rituals mattered most. The soft tap of knuckles against wood, the grip of the leather strap in your palm, the silent presence of the man beside you, standing without speaking, sharing the same breathless moment. Sometimes the watch was done in complete darkness, with no moon and clouds thick as sorrow. In those hours, even blinking felt like two. Much movement. One soldier, Henrik, used to close one eye for a full minute, then switch. He said it was so one eye's always rested in case something happens. The others copied him. Soon, it became a tradition. Don't trust both eyes, they joke. Give one a nap. Sometimes there were shooting stars. Men didn't gasp or point. They simply watched, quiet, letting the light slice across the sky like a thread drawn through heavy cloth. That one's for the ones who didn't get a sky, someone once whispered. The man beside him nodded and kept watch. Occasionally, something would move in the wire. A rabbit, a fox, a soldier from the other side, crawling low. And then the breath would catch, the rifle rise, the world narrow into the width of the barrel. But often, the trigger wasn't pulled. Not always. Because sometimes it was just another man, doing his watch, thinking his thoughts, haunted by the same ghosts. There was a rumor of a German soldier who used to sing to himself at night. Just a line or two, almost too soft to hear. Our men would freeze when it began, listening. One voice said it sounded like a hymn. Another said it was a lullaby. No one ever returned fire on the nights he sang. When the song stopped, the silence returned heavier. After one especially long night, a soldier named Brooks carved the words "He sings" into the trench wall, just above his watch post. Years later, that carving was still there, worn down by time, smoothed by fingers passing over it like a stone. Watch was also when the trench's secret caretakers emerged. A man would move a splintered plank back into place. Another would rearrange the extra boots at the base of the wall. Someone would take a half-used candle and nestle it near the latrine entrance. No orders were given. These were acts of quiet preservation, ways of saying, we still live here. And every once in a while, something beautiful happened. A fox crossed the trench, unbothered. A string of moths circled a single light. Rain began not a storm, but a soft patter like fingers drumming on your back. In those moments, soldiers looked at each other and smiled, not wide, not long, but enough. Just enough to remember the world hadn't fully ended. Eventually, the watch ended. A tap on the shoulder, a nod. The rifle was handed off like a torch. And the returning soldier, now off duty, would sit for a moment before lying down. Just a moment to listen to the night one last time, to thank it for letting him pass through untouched. In the next part, we'll return to morning, not just the physical dawn, but the emotional one. The rare letters, the parcels from home, the smell of something sweet in a place that had forgotten what sugar even meant. But for now, let the man stand quietly in the dark, listening to the night that breathes around him. Let him keep watch for all of us. All of us. Morning in the trench didn't always bring light, but sometimes it brought letters, or parcels, or, at the very least, the rumor of them. The word would travel quietly, like a scent on the wind. Posts come. And even before the first bag was seen, before the runners delivered their mud-streaked canvas sacks, the men would sit up straighter, their boots shifting under them, their hands finding their knees. It was a fragile hope, not loud, not greedy, just a quiet flutter beneath. The ribs, a heartbeat with a question. The post was rarely on time. Sometimes it arrived in clusters, not at all. Once, it came with snow still frozen into the seams of the bag. Another time, it came soaking wet, the ink on half the envelopes bleeding like shadows. But it came. And when it did, the trench changed. The reading of letters was not a public event, though it happened in public. Men would turn slightly away from each other, crouch in corners, lean against the wall as if hiding from the air. They'd read slowly, not because they were illiterate, but because they were stretching the moment, making it last. One man folded and unfolded his letter 12 times before even starting to read. Another read it backward, sentence by sentence, as though saving the ending like a sweet. The words were rarely remarkable. We miss you. The baby has your ears. The tomatoes came in late this year, but to the men, they were more than words. They were proof that another world existed. That time had continued beyond the trench, that someone somewhere still knew their name, pictured their face, still expected their return. And sometimes a letter would smell faintly of something. Soap, baking spice, ink from a desk that sat in the corner of a familiar room. One soldier burst into tears when he unfolded a letter. An pressed violet fell out, no message with it, just the flower. He carried it in his helmet for months. Then there were the package's brown paper, string-tied, bulging with contents that felt like treasure. A piece of chocolate, a knitted cap, a sock with uneven stitching, a newspaper, a half-used deck of cards, a pencil, soap wrapped in flannel. One man received a jar of honey so tightly sealed it took 3 others and the flat edge of a bayonet to open it. They passed it around with fingers, dipping carefully, smearing gold onto the crust of stale bread. No one spoke during that meal. It felt holy. Another parcel contained a harmonica, slightly dented but functional. The man who received it didn't play it, not at first. He just held it, pressed it to his lips, and breathed through it gently, as if waiting for it to sing on its own. When he finally played it, late one night, the tune was slow and broken, but the trench listened. There was a rule, silent but understood. If a man received nothing, You didn't talk about your letter. You let him be. Maybe you offered a quarter of your bread or a sip from your cup, but you didn't ask. Did you get one too? The absence was a private wound. Some men never received anything. No letters. No packages. Nothing. They stopped looking up when the runner passed. They made jokes about being invisible. Maybe I died and forgot to notice, one said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But the others remembered. They'd slip extra food into his pouch. They'd let him win card games. Once, they forged a letter 3 men working. Together, combining scraps of paper, inventing a cousin who wrote in a rush. It was a simple message. You're still remembered, even if it feels like no one's watching. A soldier who received it read it 3 times and folded it into his boot. He never asked if it was real. That didn't matter. Letters became currency, but not in the way you'd expect. They were traded in glances, in gestures. I got good news today meant I'll take your shift. No letter meant don't. Ask questions. There was a man who read his wife's letters aloud softly, only to the dirt at his feet. He said her voice used to echo in his kitchen like a pot boiling. He tried to remember the rhythm, the little pauses she took before saying something kind. She always tapped the counter with her fingernail before she said, "I love you." He once told another soldier, like she had to wake the words up first. And so, after each letter, he'd tap his helmet once, gently then fold the letter away. The tap was her voice. Some men memorized the words and then burned the letters, not out of anger, but to keep them safe. If I carry it too long, I'll lose the sound of it, one said. Better to let it rise with the smoke. Others hid them in the lining of their coats, stitching them into seams, wrapping them in plastic to keep out the damp. One man carried a single letter in his boot for so long it faded to nothing. He didn't care. It's not the words, he explained. It's the weight. And there were drawings, too. Children's pictures. Crooked houses, lopsided cats, smiling suns. They were pinned inside dugouts, taped to walls, folded into pockets like maps. A man once traced the outline of a child's drawing onto his arm with ink, saying, "If I make it home, I'll have it tattooed." He didn't make it, but his friend did, and he found a tattooist who made it permanent, a crooked sun, smiling forever on skin that once trembled with rain. In the next part, we'll explore what happened. When letters stopped arriving, when silence from home became its kind of noise, a haunting echo louder than explosions. But for now, let the letters unfold gently. Let the paper breathe. Let the men turn slightly away, holding a piece of home between trembling fingers, and remember for just a few quiet minutes who they are and who they once were before the mud swallowed their names. The silence that followed when letters stopped coming was not a silence of peace. It was a silence with teeth. It was heavier than the shell casings, thicker than the fog, and harder to swallow than the stale biscuits. They were sometimes given for dinner. There were many reasons letters might stop. A delay in the post, an address that changed without warning, a destroyed mailbag somewhere along the line. But none of those reasons mattered in the moment. What mattered was the absence, the space. That had once held a folded page, now held only air. Men would pretend it didn't affect them. They'd shrug, say, "Maybe next week," or "I think she's just busy." But the way they folded their blankets that night was different, slower, careful, like they were packing something fragile inside themselves. A soldier named Adrian received letters every Friday for 8 weeks straight. Then nothing. 1 week, 2, 3. He didn't say a word about it, just began smoking more, cleaning his rifle longer than necessary. Once, someone found him staring at the sky, mouthing the same phrase over and over. Maybe the postman forgot the way. Another man, Henry, used to read his wife's letters aloud to the trench wall, as if the mud needed to hear about their small kitchen, the overgrown garden, the neighbor's irritating dog. When her letter stopped, he read the old ones again, starting from the first. He changed the dates at the top, just to trick time, he said with a tight smile. On the fourth rereading, his voice cracked. After that, he read in silence, his lips moving, eyes wet, the words still imprinted behind his eyelids. Men created stories to explain the silence. The river froze over no way the post could have crossed. Or, there's been a paper shortage back home. Or, I bet she's writing something big. Maybe a book. That's why it's taking time. Hope, even when strained to breaking, was still a ritual. They said these things not because they believed them, but because belief was less important than rhythm. It gave shape to the silence. Without shape, it became something else. Something sharp. One soldier drew fake letters. He'd scribble on bits of paper, fold them with exaggerated care, and tuck them into his shirt pocket. "It's from my sister," he'd say, tapping the paper. "She always forgets to sign her name." No one questioned him. No one asked to see. Another began writing to himself messages from a fictional cousin in Devon who was, according to the made-up letters, always just about to visit, but never quite getting on the train. "He's got a weak ankle," the soldier explained, "but strong opinions about jam." They all knew, but they let it be. Silence made the absurd necessary. Some tried to fill the quiet with sound. A man named Biscuit whistled low, soft, tunes that never resolved. Another told stories no one had asked for, laughing too loudly at his punchlines. A third started singing to the rats, naming each one as he spotted them. "There's George. George. There's Edith. There are the twins." It wasn't madness, it was protection. Noise was the shield they used to keep the silence from settling too deeply. And then some said nothing, who simply waited, who folded and refolded their sleeves, counted the buttons on their coat, and rearranged their few belongings like a monk tending a shrine. They didn't need to speak. Their silence said enough. Someone was supposed to remember me, and they don't. In the worst cases, silence became suspicion. Maybe she's found someone else. Maybe they've moved on. Maybe they think I'm dead. One man dug a hole behind his bedroll and buried all his letters. "If she writes again, I'll dig them back up," he said. She never did. The trench became a cemetery of unopened replies, of questions that never reached their mark. But even in the grief, the ritual continued. They lined up when the post came, even if they knew there would be nothing. They listened for their name, pretended to scratch their ear when it wasn't called. And when someone else got a letter, they smiled, nodded, and clapped the man on the back. "Tell her we say hello," they'd say. And in those moments, the silence broke not for the one who received the letter, but for the ones who didn't. The echo of a remembered voice passes through them like wind through an empty room. There were rare exceptions. Long-lost letters that arrived months late, their corners frayed, the ink faded, but the words intact. When that happened, the man would sit down slowly, hands trembling, reading aloud as if translating scripture. "The dog is getting fatter. The schoolteacher eloped. We canned peaches yesterday." Such plainness, such holiness. One soldier folded his long-awaited letter into a paper boat and floated it down a puddle in the trench. "It's too beautiful to keep," he said. "Let the rats have poetry." Another taped his to the ceiling above his cot, so he'd see it every time he closed his eyes. And some never got their silence broken. They left the trench with empty pockets and full throats, carrying questions that would never find a mouth. In the next part, we'll listen to the things men said when they believed no one was listening. The confessions, the regrets, the prayers they whispered into the dark mud like seeds no one would water. But for now, let the paper stay folded. Let the envelope rest in an open palm. Let the silence settle, but not stay. And let someone somewhere still be writing, just a little late. Some of the most honest words in the trenches were spoken. Into nothing confessions made not to friends, or superiors, or chaplains, but to the air, to the mud, to the darkness that held its breath like a trusted keeper of secrets. It often happened at night, but not always. Sometimes it was during long gray afternoons when nothing moved except the smoke curling from someone's cigarette. A man would be staring into the middle distance, his fingers absently tracing circles into the stock of his rifle, and suddenly he'd begin to talk, not loudly, not urgently, just steadily, like someone narrating a story to a fire. "I never told her I was leaving," one soldier murmured, not to anyone in particular. "Just kissed her hand and walked out. I hope she made something of that kiss." Another, polishing a belt buckle with a scrap of wool, said into the stillness, "I used to steal from my uncle's bakery. Just the ends of loaves." But still, no one responded. Not because they weren't listening, but because responses weren't needed. The trench knew how to hold silence in the right shape, open enough to receive, closed enough to protect. Some men confessed regrets that were barely regrets at all, as if testing the shape of guilt in their mouths. "I hated school," said one, "but I missed the smell of the books." Another laughed softly and said, "I told my brother I wished he were the one going. I didn't mean it. Now he writes me every week." Then there were the whispered prayers half remembered, stitched together from childhood, or improvised in the moment. A man named Oscar used to crouch beside a bent plank every night and whisper, "Let me be cold if I have to. Let me be hungry. Just don't let me forget my mother's voice." Another placed his hand over his chest and whispered, "May the yaw next bullet not know my name." Some men made no sound at all. Their confessions were in gestures, how they folded their letters, how they cleaned their boots with reverence, how they touched their helmet before sleep like a father patting a child good night. There was a soldier who carved tally marks, not for days survived, but for memories recovered. "Each mark is something I remembered that I thought was gone," he explained. "The way my dog barked when I opened the back gate, the shape of the ceiling cracks above my bed, the smell of burnt sugar on Sundays." His wall had 17 marks, then 20, then 30. Each line is a tiny rebellion against forgetting. The trench became a cathedral for this strange, hushed honesty. No sermons, just murmurings. No choir, just the steady hum of human breath. Even men who didn't believe in anything found themselves muttering to the fog, "If there's something, after this, let it have clean water." Or, "Tell the sky I tried." Or, "Please let my shoes be dry tomorrow." These weren't dramatic cries. They were soft barters, offered to any listening ear, divine or otherwise. The rats heard them. The damp heard them. The wood planks heard them. And sometimes another man heard too. Not always by accident. A pair of soldiers once took turns confessing one line at a time, back and forth like a lullaby. "I lied to my father," one said. "I kissed a boy once," the other replied. "I stole a lantern. I wanted to be a dancer. I was afraid the first time I held a rifle. I still am." Afterward, they didn't mention it again, but they sat closer that night, one hand resting lightly over the other's wrist, not romantic, not desperate, just real, honest, grounded. When a soldier died, his last words, if there were any, were treated with deep, wordless respect. One man's final whisper was, "Don't. Let my sister wear black." Another simply said, "Bury me next to someone who won't mind." And then some said nothing at all, whose final breath was just that, a breath, carrying the sum of a life into the sky. For them, their friends, sometimes added a final word on their behalf. They would write it on a scrap of paper or whisper it aloud during the burial. Words like forgiven, or still remembered, or he dreamed of oranges. These tiny acts mattered. They gave shape to the shapeless grief. And then there were the shared myths, the trench's folklore of confessions and secrets. One story told of a soldier who sang only when no one was near, but every time he sang, a letter would arrive the next day. Another was about a man who whispered his hometown's name into the ground each night, believing the earth would remember the way home for him. No one knew if it worked, but one morning a wildflower bloomed near his bedroll, the only one for miles. After that, men began whispering their hometown names too, just in case. The confessions weren't about cleansing or penance. They were about weight, about the things too heavy to carry alone. The trench didn't judge. It was too old, too tired, too full of its secrets. And when the words were spoken, they didn't disappear, they softened, folded themselves into the mud, became part of the wood grain, drifted into the mist rising over the trench wall. In the next part, we'll walk alongside memory itself, how soldiers tried to preserve it, hold it, pass it on, even as the days blurred and the war tried to strip them of stories. But for now, let the trench be still. Let the secrets breathe. Let the earth cradle the confessions of those who spoke only when they thought no one was listening. Memory in the trenches was not something fixed. It was something shifting, like fog curling along the floorboards of the mind. It drifted, disappeared, reappeared in different forms. The men didn't trust it, but they clung to it anyway, like someone holding on to the corner of a photograph that had nearly burned. Memory was not a luxury in the trench, it was a resistance. It was the one part of the war no one could take, at least not all at once. So they did everything they could to protect it. Some men carried objects of course tokens, photographs, folded scraps of maps or handwritten addresses, but even more powerful were the memories stored in their rituals. A soldier named Eames brushed his teeth every morning with the same broken brush, not because he believed it cleaned anything, but because it was what his father did. "My dad never started the day without a clean mouth," he told someone once, even during the strikes. And so, in a trench where nothing was ever clean, Eames kept that memory alive with each scrape of bristle across his teeth. Another man, Hamid, lit a match every evening just to watch it burn, then pinched it out and whispered a single word. No one ever heard the word. When asked, he smiled and said, "It's the name of something I refuse to forget." Then there were the men who kept their memories organized, like shelves in a dark library. A soldier named Beck had a ritual he called the rewind. Every night, before sleeping, he would close his eyes and walk mentally through the hallway of Val, his childhood home. He described it once, in soft detail. The way the second stair creaked, the smell of garlic near the kitchen door, the dent in the left side of the bathroom sink. "If I forget the creak," he whispered one night, "then the house starts to fade." Another soldier drew a new memory every day in the dirt with the end of his bayonet. A street lamp, a bicycle, a bakery window, a snow-covered fence. The drawings lasted only until the next boot scuffed them away, but that didn't matter. "It's the drawing, not the staying," he'd say. There were also memory chains, unspoken agreements between men to remember something on each other's behalf. One soldier forgot the name of his dog back home, and it crushed him. His friend took the name Biscuit and wrote it in ink on the inside of his collar. "I'll carry it until it returns to you," he promised. Others memorized stories they'd never lived, family recipes, lullabies, wedding speeches taught to them by trenchmates in the quiet hours. In one corner of the trench, there was a trio of men who began creating a new memory together. A fictional village by the sea, where every house had a red roof, and the bakery never ran out of sugar. They gave the village a name, Holloway, and added to it nightly. "There's a tree in the center," one said, "with lanterns hanging from the branches, and a shop with tiny bells on the door," added another. "And a woman who sings every morning from her balcony," said the third. It became real to them, so real that they began drawing maps of it, etching it into the wood panels with pieces of wire. When one of the men died, the others added a small cross to the map near the village pond. "He made it home," they said. Memory also lived in sounds. A soldier from Dublin taught his trenchmates the rhythm of his city's morning bells. He'd tap them out on an empty mess tin. Ding, pause, ding, ding, pause, ding, ding, ding. "There," he'd say, "that's the bakery bell. That one's the church. That one means the fishmonger's just opened." The others learned it by heart. When he was wounded and sent away, someone else tapped the rhythm each morning just once. The sound became his echo. But not all memories were sweet. Some men remembered things they wished they could forget, sounds that stuck in the teeth, images that reappeared behind the eyes. For those, rituals became fences. One man carried a strip of linen soaked in peppermint oil. Whenever the bad memories crept close, he'd press it to his nose and breathe deeply, whispering, "Not now." Another repeated the phrase, "Let the clock keep ticking," whenever his mind wandered to the place where the scream had started. Sometimes they helped each other carry the darker memories. One soldier recited his worst night the full, unbearable thing to another. Under strict oath, it would never be repeated. The listener nodded, said nothing, and drew a line in the dirt. "It's buried now," he said. "I'll carry the ghost for a while." And he did, never mentioning it again, never flinching when that ghost walked nearby. Some tried to forget, on purpose. A soldier named Liar wrote down every memory he could on tiny scraps of paper and released them one by one into the wind. "If it's meant to return, it will," he said. Another rubbed dirt into his childhood photo until the face was blurred. Better to become a stranger than lose him slowly. But even those who tried to forget found that memory had other plans. It came back in dreams, in smells, in the rhythm of rain on a helmet. One man once sat bolt upright in the middle of the night and whispered, "My mother's cupboard had 3 shells." No one replied, but everyone understood. In the next part, we'll hear what happened when men began to imagine the end out. Just of the war, but of their time in the trench. The plans they made, the promises whispered, the way the dream of leaving sometimes became heavier than the trench itself. But for now, let the memories rest. Let the lanterns in Holloway flicker softly. Let the peppermint oil hold back the darkness. And let the second stair still creak somewhere in the quiet hallway of someone's mind, even in a place so soaked with mud, memory, and waiting. Men dreamed of the end, not the end of war in the grand political sense, not victory parades or headlines, but the simple, personal moment of leaving the trench. That one breath beyond the barbed wire. That one step onto dry land where no gunfire echoed. They planned their exits like architects designing invisible doors. Not all at once, not aloud, but in fragments, in gestures, in soft night whispers, passed between friends like secret messages. Some men made real plans, lists. First thing I'll do is take a bath. A real one, with hot water and soap that smells like lemons. Or, I'll go back to the bakery and ask if they remember me. Others weren't so specific. They'd say, "There's a hill behind my town. I'm going to lie on it for 3 days straight." Or, "I'll walk to the station and wait for a train without knowing where it's going." These weren't plans in the strictest sense. They were futures. Futures that needed shape to be believed. A man named Harold dug a hole in the side of the trench and called it the window. It didn't look out onto anything, just more. Mud, but he told the others that it faced south toward home. Each morning I look through it, he said, and pretend I see my father watering the garden. Another soldier tied a bit of string around his wrist. When I get out, I'll leave it on a tree branch, he whispered, so I'll know I made it. There was a man who traced the same route on his boot every night with his fingertip, following an invisible path he claimed led to his favorite riverbank. He never named the river. He just called it the cool place. And yet, as much as they'd planned their escape, most men didn't fully believe it would happen. Not really. The trench had a way of making itself eternal, like the sky or the sea. So these exit plans became rituals of resistance, quiet ways of reminding the soul. It was still mobile, still capable of motion beyond the mud. Men began to invent return ceremonies. One soldier said he'd eat 6 eggs the day he got back, even if they make me sick. Another swore he'd knock on every door in his neighborhood just to hear someone say, "You're home." One promised to write a thank you note to every tree he passed. They stood up through all of it, he explained. Some rehearsed their reunion scenes, smiling in the dark, practicing how to say hello without crying, practicing how not to say anything at all, just hold, just collapse into someone's arms. "I'll hug my brother like I'm drowning," one man whispered. Another man carved a wooden coin and told everyone, "Whoever's standing next to me when the shelling stops gets this. It means we made it out together." The coin passed hands many times. By the end, no one knew who originally carved it, but it kept moving, smooth from use, from hope. Some men imagined they'd walk out of the trench and forget it all, instantly, like stepping through a curtain into a world that never knew this place. "I'll leave my boots right here," said one, tapping a plank beside him, "and walk barefoot back." Others knew better. "I'll carry it forever," one said, "but I'll carry it quieter." There were questions no one knew how to answer. Would the sky feel too big when you left? Would food taste too rich? Would a crowded street be terrifying after years of hearing only whispers? A man named Charles kept a list in his pocket called "Things I've Forgotten How to Do." It included riding a bicycle, lighting a match without shielding it, singing in front of people, and sleeping without boots. "I'll relearn one each week," he promised himself. Others planned what not to do. "I won't tell stories about here," said one man. "I won't make it sound braver than it was." "I won't wear green," said another. "It looks too much like sickness." A third said, "I won't laugh loudly for a long time. Not until it feels like mine again." Still, some men had no plans at all. They didn't know what waited for them beyond the trench. They didn't want to think about it. The idea of after was too sharp, too distant. For them, others carried the imagining. "When you get out," one man would say, "go see my sister. Tell her I still remember the necklace she wore on Sundays." And so the promise was made. Little assignments passed on, like flares tossed across time. Not everyone expected to go home in one piece. Some men spoke calmly of their missing fingers, or bad lungs, or the limp they knew would never fade. They folded their brokenness into the plan. "When I sit on the porch, I'll cross the good leg," one said with a smile. "No one will notice the other." Another imagined learning to cook with one hand. "The eggs won't care," he said. And just a few spoke of not going back at all. Not because they expected to die, but because something inside them had shifted so deeply they feared the old world wouldn't fit anymore. "I'll build a new life near water," one said. "No cities, no stairs, just light." Another said, "I'll stay where the quiet is." These weren't escapist dreams. They were soft rebuildings, visions crafted from absence. And then they planned for each other. One soldier gave his trenchmate a key on a string. "To my family's garage," he said. "If I don't make it, tell them you're my brother." No more was said, but the key was worn every day after, pressed warm against skin. In the next part, we'll hear what it felt like when the moment of leaving came, when orders were given, bags packed, the trench stepped out of like an old coat. But for now, let them dream it. Let them plan the way out, not with maps, but with soft rituals. Let them whisper to the future, as if it were listening from just beyond the wire. When the time finally came to leave the trench, whether through reassignment, injury, end of tour, or some bureaucratic twist, it felt too surreal to be real. It didn't feel like triumph. It didn't feel like escape. It felt like trying to peel your skin off while still needing it. The trench had become more than a hole in the earth. It had become a rhythm, a prison, a womb, a map of fear that your body had memorized. Leaving it meant forgetting how to be shaped by it. Orders came down softly, like whispers with uniforms. Pack your things. There's a truck waiting. You're rotating out. The words felt unreal, like hearing someone say, "You may now float," and then expecting your feet to lift off the ground. Men who had dreamed of this day found themselves frozen, staring at their boots like they were nailed down. Some packed quickly, folding socks and ration tins with precision, trying not to look at anyone. Others moved slowly, as if hoping someone would say it was a mistake. And some didn't pack at all. They just sat, waiting for it to feel true. There was no celebration, no waving, no goodbyes, just nods, grips of the shoulder, a shared glance, with too much history in it to explain. One soldier, Marcus, stood at the edge of the trench for nearly 10 minutes, staring back into it before stepping up onto the earth above. "It looks smaller than it felt," he said. Another removed his boots and set them side by side at his dugout's edge. "Let the trench keep them," he said softly. "They belong more to it than to me." There were strange last-minute rituals. One man scratched his initials into the same plank where 30 other names had been carved. Another left behind his lucky stone, carefully placing it in a crevice near the latrine wall. "Someone else will need it now," he whispered. A third took a photo of himself in the trench, just his shadow on the wall, stretched long by the morning light. "So I remember who I was here," he explained. When they climbed out, the world above seemed too bright, too big, too loud with silence. No gunfire, no distant thumps, no constant whispering from men pressed shoulder to shoulder. Just sky, just breathe. Just the sound of leaves in a tree they hadn't seen in weeks. Many men looked at the trees the same way they looked. At fire for the first time, like something mythical returned from a dream. And yet there was guilt, a heaviness that came with leaving while others stayed. One man cried as he passed his trenchmate's helmet to him. "I washed it," he said, "with my scarf." Another refused to step over the top until he had, whispered something to the ground. No one heard what it was. He walked away quietly after. Those who stayed behind never asked questions. He went, they'd say, and leave it at that. The space he left would be filled with a blanket, or a box, or a silence that took time to settle. And the ones who left found themselves walking through fields, along roads, sitting in trucks, trying to believe that motion was real again. One man kept reaching for the trench wall that was no longer there. "My left hand feels like it's missing a wall," he joked, though his voice didn't laugh. The food tasted wrong. Shoes felt light. The wind on the face was unfamiliar, like a stranger touching your skin without permission. Some men returned to cities, others to hospitals, others to the next assignment. But none returned unchanged. And for those few who made it all the way home, the trench remained, not as a place, but as a rhythm etched into their sleep, into their gait, into the way they folded their shirts or paused before entering a quiet room. One soldier said he couldn't sleep in beds with too much softness. "I miss the press of the earth on my ribs," he explained. Another refused to eat from metal dishes. "Too many echoes," he muttered. "Too many ghosts." For weeks, even months, men would catch themselves listening for drips, for rustling boots, for the faint crackle of a candle flame, but hear only stillness. Some recreated trench rituals at home. One lit a candle before every dinner, even in daylight. One tapped the heel of his boot before walking into the garden. One built a wooden bench shaped exactly like the plank he sat on for 6 months. "I like how it remembers me," he said. Letters became difficult. "How was it?" people asked, and the men didn't know how to answer. Some said, "It was cold." Others said, "We waited a lot." A few said, "We laughed sometimes," and left it there. The truth was too big, too quiet, too slow to tell. But when two men who had served together met again accidentally, in a station or a market, they didn't need to speak. They'd nod or share a look or sit quietly beside each other, and the rhythm would return. The remembered silence, the shared breath. The trench carried not in boots or scars, but in the pause between sentences, in the way the hands moved, in the way shoulders tilted slightly toward each other in trust. In the next part, we'll explore how those who came back built lives on top of trench-shaped memories, how they turned quiet into kindness, how they taught their children about patience, how they became gentle, not despite the war, but because of it. But for now, let the trench exhale. Let the boots stay where they were placed. Let the string stay tied around the wrist. Let the man walk forward, even if every step echoes with the place he just left behind. Some men never spoke of the trench again, not because they wanted to forget, but because they knew the trench didn't belong to words. It belonged to gestures, to quiet, to a stillness they carried like a tucked-in shirt or a folded prayer. Those who came back were not always the loud ones, or the ones with stories ready to pour. Often they were the ones who stood quietly in doorways, who stirred their tea a little longer than necessary, who listened before they spoke. They brought home with them not horror, not even heroism, but something much more peculiar: boredom, in its truest, deepest form. And with it, a kind of reverence for the mundane. These were men who found beauty in the ordinary, who sat on porches and stared at clotheslines, who closed their eyes to feel the warmth of a cup in both hands, who picked up socks from the floor and folded them like they were holding history. They didn't need excitement. They'd had enough of that. What they wanted, what they cherished, was uneventfulness. A dinner that arrived on time, a roof that didn't leak, a night where the only sound was the ticking of a clock. One man, a baker named Samuel, refused to rush anything ever again. He stirred dough slowly, let it rise without a timer. "The trench teaches you not to interrupt things," he said. "You learn how to wait, how to let something become." Another man, a teacher named Roland, never raised his voice in class. Not once, even when boys misbehaved. He'd pause, wait for quiet, then speak so gently the children leaned in to hear him. "They listen because they have to," he once told his wife. "Not because they're afraid, but because the quiet matters." Many of the men who returned started gardens, whether they'd gardened before or not. Something about the feel of dirt under the nails, the slow unfurling of green from brown, the patience required, it mirrored something they understood deeply. "Now, plants don't shout," one man said. "They don't ask why you're crying. They just grow." Others volunteered at libraries, became postmen, took jobs in quiet train stations where the schedules never changed. They weren't avoiding the world. They were selecting the parts of it that moved slow enough to match their new tempo. Some found it hard, of course. Not all wounds are visible. Some men panicked at the sound of thunder, flinched at the scent of smoke, walked in circles when the lights went out. But even then, they found ways to soften the edges. One built birdhouses, dozens of them, hung them in every tree on his property. "So I'm never alone when the wind comes," he said. Another rewrote the same letter to his lost friend every Sunday. He never sent it, just folded it neatly and placed it in a box marked "Still Here." And many of them carried small rituals home with them, tapping door frames before entering rooms, lighting candles not for scent, but for memory, sitting on the floor when it rained. One man carved a spoon for each of his children, not fancy ones, plain, thick-handled, honest. "So they'll never forget that simple things matter," he explained. A few of the men, only a few, spoke about the trench to those who didn't understand. But most didn't, not because they feared being misunderstood, but because they respected the shape of silence. "If you weren't there," one man said, "you shouldn't have to carry it." But they did teach, in the way they paused before speaking, in the way they touched someone's shoulder when they passed behind them, in the way they looked at the sky during a quiet evening and whispered, almost without realizing, "Let it stay like this." Their families learned to recognize the signs. When he stirred his coffee 3 times counterclockwise, it meant he was remembering. When he stood in the garden without tools, it meant he needed time. When he sat with his boots still on, staring at the radio but not listening, it meant he was hearing something else entirely. And they let him. They let him sit. Because they knew the trench was still somewhere inside him, not as a nightmare, but as a quiet room, a place where socks dry slowly, where spoons are passed without words, where you hold your breath when someone coughs. And slowly, the world adjusted to them. Or perhaps they adjusted the world. One teacher refused to teach history as a timeline. "We'll learn it by feelings," he told his students. This was a time when people were afraid. This was a time when they sang to survive. This was a time when silence was everything. And when a child asked what the war was like, he said, "It was long, it was muddy, and sometimes it was very, very quiet." Another man retired, soft-spoken, ran a community soup kitchen, never talked about the war, but every bowl of soup was served with a clean spoon and a folded napkin. And every table had a candle, even in daylight. "It's not for the light," he said once. "It's for the stillness." And still others carried their trench mates with them, in photographs, in the way they whistled a tune that had no name, in the habit of setting an extra chair at the table, not out of grief but out of love, quiet love, lasting love. And for those who never returned, their silence was carried by those who did. One man planted a tree for every name he remembered. He etched initials into the bottom of his walking. "Stick, so they're with me every step," he said. "In the next and final part, we'll gather everything, every whisper, every ritual, every strange moment of peace, born from war, and let the story rest. But for now, let the spoon be carved. Let the boots stay on. Let the man sit by the window, watching the wind ripple the laundry, and feel no need to move. And now the trench sleeps, not forgotten, but softened. It no longer leaks, no longer groans under the weight of boots or echoes with the murmur of men whispering dreams into damp air. It is quiet now, like an old book closed with care, its pages worn, its spine still warm from the hands that held it. The trench lives on, not in history books or medals, but in the lives built afterward, in the way a father braids his daughter's hair without rushing, in the way an old man stops to tie a neighbor's shoe. Softly someone lights a candle, without needing a reason. These men didn't seek fame. They didn't return home craving applause. They returned wanting only the peace of a night uninterrupted, a roof that didn't shake, a spoon that didn't clatter, They wanted boredom, the most sacred boredom, the kind that lets the heart rest, that lets time pass without fear, that welcomes the familiar like a friend. And so they built lives shaped not by what they escaped, but by what they learned in the silence between shellings. They taught us how to wait, how to whisper, how to listen for the sound of rain and feel grateful it is just rain. In their gardens, the soil was turned slowly. In their kitchens, meals were stirred with 2 hands and no clock. They hugged longer, sat in stillness with those who grieved, asked fewer questions, spoke in shorter sentences. But every word was earned, every pause sacred. One man told bedtime stories to his grandchildren that had no endings. "So you can dream the rest," he said. Another wrote postcards to no one and left them in books at the library. "Someone who needs it will find it," he whispered. They didn't build monuments. They built benches, fences, loaves of bread, new routines. They wrote letters and burned them, drew names in the frost on the windows, kissed hands before shaking them. Some visited the trench again years later, found it buried, half swallowed by time, grown over with moss and silence. They stood there and said nothing. What was there to say? The place remembered them. That was enough. Others never returned, not physically, but each night, as they tucked into bed, they whispered thank yous to the ceiling, or pressed their hands together without speaking, remembering the man who once passed them tea without a word during the coldest morning of their lives. The trench became a memory shared not in facts, but in habits. In the way someone touches a doorframe before walking through. In the way an entire family learns to serve soup silently on Sundays. And now, perhaps, as you listen in your own stillness, you can feel it too, not the horror, not the noise, but the strange comfort that comes from knowing the worst has passed, and you are still here. That even in mud, kindness bloomed. That even among rats and rifles, someone folded a blanket for someone else. That even as men begged for boredom, they made it sacred. Perhaps your eyes are closed now. Perhaps your breathing is slow, steady. If not, take a breath. Let it linger. Let it echo softly in the space between your thoughts. This story was never about war. It was always about what came after. About the quiet courage it takes to live gently, to live slowly, to live in honor of all the men who lit candles in tunnels and counted the stars they couldn't see. Tonight, you carry their silence, not as a burden, but as a lullaby. So sleep now. Let the trench close. Let the plank settle beneath your back. Let the tin cup rest. Let the boots dry by the fire that never went out. You've heard their story. And now it's yours too. Breathe gently. Drift softly. You are safe. You are home.